Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chairman of YPO Metro New York. And I am so excited to introduce all of you to the legendary Matt Ridley. Matt, welcome. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm happy, thanks to that song by Bobby McFerrin. Thank you, Barry.
Well, thank you for picking that song. I think it got us all into a better mindset as we were waiting for the room to go live. I'm so happy to have you here. So Matt's dialing in from Newcastle in England. I'm here in New York City. We both have globes behind us because we love to think globally. And our audience today is truly coming from across the world, from LA to Vietnam and everywhere in between. And I'm so glad that everybody's here. So our goal today, we're going to be reflecting on the topic of how we can all better master innovation and creating the environments that enables innovation and improvement to happen. And obviously, this is a critical topic. Every conversation we have here in this series is focused on how can we become better leaders, how can we navigate critical trends, and how can we bolster our well-being. And innovation is at the heart and soul of so much that we do, but also so much that impacts us. And Matt is a truly extraordinary guide for this subject. He is an award-winning science author whose books have sold more than 1 million copies around the world. He is world-renowned for his provocative writings on science, economics, and the environment. And his latest work is called How Innovation Works. And he also frequently writes for The Economist, The Times of London, as well as the Wall Street Journal. He's also a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. So in our conversation today, we're going to really dig in and make this as actionable as possible for everybody. I also want to encourage everybody's creative listening and thoughtful interaction. So as we're ready to get going, I want everybody to type in where you're dialing in from so we know where you are, and also why you're here. What led you to reserve this hour of all the other things you could have done? What brought you here? What's your intention? What are you looking to get out of it? And we'll dive in from there. So Matt, once again, thank you for being here. And to kick us off, I want to ask you, what was your intention writing this latest work, right? There's thousands of books around innovation, and there's so many other areas you could have focused on. What did you find was missing in the world that led you to writing this work? And why do you think it's so important for business leaders who are dialing into this call today?
Well, Barry, there are thousands of books on innovation, but most of them assume that we know what it is and why it happens, when and where it does, and how we turn it on and turn it off. And I don't think that's true. I wanted to go back to basics and say, I'm not sure we fully understand this mysterious thing called innovation, which is incredibly important to the modern world. It's the reason we're living lives of great prosperity compared with our ancestors. It's the reason the world changes. So it's absolutely central to our lives, but I'm not sure we really do know how to turn it on, how to turn it off. And I think we're under a lot of misapprehensions about it. So one of the first things I wanted to do, for example, was nail the myth that innovation is about brilliant inventors having eureka moments and all on their own, jumping out of the bath and running down the street shouting eureka, as Archimedes did, and the rest is easy. It's not like that. It's a team sport. It's a collective, collaborative thing. It's very much a lot of hard work. The other thing that I sort of slightly don't like is this word creativity. Because, yeah, sure, I think it's wonderful that people can be creative, but sometimes it seems to imply to people, particularly young people, that there is some special genius juice that some people have and others don't. You've either got creativity or you haven't. And I'm not sure that's meaningful. I think it is more important to think in terms of working hard, doing trial and error, being open-minded, collaborating. These are the things that make innovation work well. So, well, I should say that my main motive for writing this book was to satisfy my own curiosity about the subject. That's why I write any book, is always because I'm curious about it. I want to understand it better, and I want to teach myself something.
Excellent. Well, in the process of doing that, you've done a tremendous service to all of us by not just looking at what's driven innovation across different fields, across different times, but also crystallizing the essentials of innovation. Before we dive into the nitty gritty here, I do want you to dive a little bit deeper on crystallizing for us what you believe are the biggest myths around innovation, what people most mistake for innovation. And I want to do that. You already started mentioning some of them. It's really so that you can challenge us to maybe reframe in our minds what we think we know, but because you've written a book on it, well, we might be actually off track a little bit. So
yeah,
please share.
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is the difference between innovation and invention. At least that's my distinction that I'm making here between the two concepts. Invention means coming up with a new widget, a new gadget, a new idea, a new habit. And then we tend to assume that if you do that, the world will beat a path to your door and it's all easy. And I think that's wrong. I think if you look at the history of innovations, the prize went to the person who then, having developed an invention, said, now I'm going to work out how to make it affordable, how to make it reliable, and how to make it available to people. And those are not trivial problems. And we've tended to underestimate the importance of the people who defeat those problems. So just to take a couple of examples, there's a guy called Malcolm McLean, who is the father of container shipping. He died, but was the father of container shipping. He's the man who basically revolutionized world trade by insisting that standardized containers that could go on the back of trucks could also be put straight onto ships, that you didn't, as it were, break bulk. You didn't take things out of trucks to put them on ships. You just put containers on ships. This was a revolution in the 1960s, which had enormous impact. It's responsible for the growth of world trade to a large degree, I think. It brought the cost of trade down dramatically. There's no invention in there. There's no new device. There's no new software. It's just saying, here's a different way of doing the world that I want to persuade the world to do. His story is very interesting. Or take a more recent example, Jeff Bezos. Bezos is an innovator, I think we can all agree, but I don't think he's an inventor. He wouldn't claim to be. He wouldn't claim to have come up with e-commerce all by himself, but he sure has changed the world by driving through that. So that's the biggest and the first distinction that I think is really important. And there are other myths that I try and tackle, like we talk a lot about innovation being disruptive. And that tends to give us the impression that it's sudden, but actually it isn't sudden. It's nearly always gradual. It's nearly always a long preamble before the technology is ready to take over the world, and then a long postamble, if you like, when the technology continues to be incrementally improved. Something like Moore's law is a very good description, a steady improvement in the technology for computing year in, year out. That's a much better description of how the world works. It does result in disruptive changes. It results in digital photography, which causes Kodak to suddenly go bust or something. But behind it are gradual trends, not sudden trends.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. So I want us to now dive into what you found to be the essentials of innovation. And what I'd love for you to do is, before diving into each one in depth, I'd love to hear kind of your overview of, like, when you took a look at all these different innovations through history, and when you narrowed it down to those recurring themes, just give us a bird's eye view on, like, what does that map look like? What seems to be the key ingredients? And then what I'd love to do is to go into each of those and ideally have you challenge us on what we could be doing better in our organizations, in our lives, to better live in accordance to this. For everybody participating live, I want to also challenge everybody to actively listen. And my challenge to you is as follows. Please try to, through the course of this hour we have together, try to narrow down what is your one most important critical learning from everything that Matt has shared, something that you can share with your teams and the world at large. And then what is one key action you can take in the coming days based on that learning? So please keep that in mind, and we're going to keep the conversation going for those who are interested in a WhatsApp group so that we can share those key action items and keep each other appraised of our success stories. So Matt, please share with us the essentials of innovation as you've narrowed them down.
Well, before I do that, I just want to say one thing, which is that I'm acutely aware that many of the people listening to this are themselves business leaders, entrepreneurs, people, scientists, innovators, who are in the business of innovating themselves. And they will, to some extent, know this field as well or better than me. I mean, I don't claim to be an innovator myself. That's part of my curiosity about this field, is to come in from outside and describe what I see. So I'm looking forward to learning from what others say today as well, and also finding out whether or not the things I say reverberate with people who are actually at the coalface of innovation and doing it. So some of the things that I learned about innovation that came out again and again from the stories I told, because I just tell a bunch of stories at the beginning of the book, you know, the steam engine, the search engine, vaccines, vaping, you know, whatever it might be. I tell the story of how they came about, and then I try and distill out the common themes. As I mentioned, that there's a gradualness about them that we tend to miss, that they're serendipitous. Now, serendipitous is a posh way of saying lucky, that you have to be able to change direction. Kevlar, Teflon, the Post-it note were all invented by people looking for something different. They were surprised by what they found and they had to change direction. That's quite common in innovation, that you don't end up inventing the thing you thought you were inventing. They're evolutionary. That is to say, if you look at the designs of motor cars or the designs of mobile phones, you can see a pedigree, you can see a family tree, you can see a descent with modification, as Charles Darwin called it. And they're evolutionary in another sense too, which is that they're recombinant. What I mean by that is that just as we make new genetic combinations when we have sex, we literally mix the genes of two parents together in new combinations. So the same is true with innovation. Through trade, we bring together ideas that occurred to different people in different times and different places and recombine them. And nearly all our technologies consist of existing technologies combined in different ways. My favorite example of this is a thing called the pill camera, which was invented after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. That's the kind of thing I mean when I say ideas having sex. As I've mentioned before, it's a team sport. It's not an individual pursuit. We make the mistake of thinking that the lonely genius in the ivory tower is going to change the world. Actually, it never works that way. If you look at something like the invention of the aeroplane, what the Wright brothers did right and their rivals did wrong was they shared ideas with other people. They constantly collaborated. They drew upon they corresponded with people all over the world to try and understand gliders and birds and all sorts of things. Trial and error is very important to innovators, much more so than I think the general public realizes. People like Thomas Edison, but also people like Jeff Bezos stress this. They say, look, you have to just keep trying things. And Edison tried 6,000 different types of plant material before he settled upon the filament of his light bulb, and he settled upon Japanese bamboo to make the filament of his light bulb because that was the material that was going to last the longest. There are some other themes which I can come back to as we go on, but those are some of the first. That's a first take on the essentials of innovation as I see it.
Excellent. And so, just to give us some historical anchoring here, if you could share with us, where are we right now? Like since the dawn of civilization up to, our current age right now, what have been like the key universals of innovation, like in these essentials that you've mentioned? And where would you see us as a society right now in our relationship to innovation? Many believe today that actually the world is in bad shape. We're not doing so great. There's others who think that it's never been better. Just share with us where we're at, and then we're going to take these essentials and figure out how we can better integrate them in our organization.
Well, human beings have been experiencing innovation for tens of thousands of years. I mean, the dog is an innovation that I write about in the book, and that probably was domesticated 40,000 years ago. Whether we domesticated it or it domesticated us or it domesticated itself is not clear, but it's probably an innovation in a sense. But the pace of innovation was extraordinarily slow. Agriculture was an innovation 10,000 years ago, very important one, very significant one, but you could have lived through several generations without seeing any innovation in your life at that time. And that was true right up until maybe 1700, 300 years ago, at which point suddenly innovations began to happen faster and faster and faster, so that you did experience innovation in your lifetime, not just in one product, but in many, and in many aspects of your life. We call this the Industrial Revolution. There were several other periods of fast innovation, the Song dynasty in China, Renaissance Italy, and so on, but none of them were sustained. None of them kept going in the way the Industrial Revolution did. And the Industrial Revolution kept gathering pace. So once electricity came along at the end of the 19th century, you get an accelerated phase of innovation. After the World War II, you get even faster innovation. Then you get the computer. But, and here's where, I mean, let me just say, I am an optimist. I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist. I think the world is getting better, not worse. I think that will continue. I think that the horrors of this pandemic will pass and we will get back to creating more prosperity. We have driven poverty down faster than any previous generation. That's an extraordinary achievement. Places like Africa are seeing rapid improvements in living standards at the moment and rapid declines in violence and disease, such as they've never experienced before. So this is a great time to be alive. And that's almost entirely down to innovation. The reason malaria mortality is falling is because of a very simple innovation, the insecticide-treated bed net to protect you from mosquitoes, championed by the Gates Foundation. So those are the sorts of things that are changing the world even as we speak. But I also argue that we aren't necessarily living through a period of rapid innovation. We think we are because we have to replace our cell phone every year by a new model. And in the digital world, we are seeing incessant innovation. But in the rest of our lives, not so much. When I was a child, the future was going to be all about spectacular innovations in transport, supersonic flights, routine space travel, personal jetpacks that enabled you to jump around the world. None of that happened. We're still flying in 747s. They entered service in 1969, 51 years ago. Imagine if our computers were from that date. So actually, there are areas of our life, including transport, and I would argue more recently, more imminent, more immediately, vaccination. You know, think how the development of vaccines has not improved in recent decades, how we're still looking at years to develop a vaccine against COVID-19, even though we developed a vaccine against whooping cough in the 1930s in 4 years flat. We haven't really improved on that. So actually there are all sorts of areas in which we should lament the failure to be more innovative in the current world than we are. And there are great opportunities for people who can solve those problems.
Beautifully said, Matt. Thank you. So what I want to do now is, on the one hand, let's focus on how do we create, as leaders, how do we create the environments to enable innovation to flourish? So that's looking in, right? What should we do individually? And then what should we do within our organizations? From there, I want to jump into what you just mentioned, which is the opportunities out there in the world, right? Maybe it's not these like groundbreaking invention out of anywhere, but like innovations that can massively change how we live, how long we live, and how best we take care of each other. So very excited for that. So when you looked at it, and it's the subtitle of your book is, you know, it's how innovation works and then why it flourishes in freedom. What do you mean by that? And how do we like actually do specific things within our organizations to create that environment that allows innovation to flourish?
Right. Well, globally, it's true that the more freedom people have had, the more they've innovated. So if you look around the world, empires are not very good at fostering innovation. The Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ming Empire. The Song Empire in China was very good at innovation. That's when they developed gunpowders, and compasses and printed paper and things like that. And what was key about the Song Empire was that it was very decentralized. It wasn't run from the center in a top-down way. It allowed people to do experiments. It allowed people, entrepreneurs were very free to develop and do what they liked. And that, of course, was the secret of America for much of the 20th century. And particularly the fact that different states had different rules and different habits meant that entrepreneurs could move around till they found a congenial regime in which to be an entrepreneur. So innovation really likes freedom in the political sense. Well, political is the wrong word, economic freedom. Because one of the things I grapple with in the book is why China is so innovative nowadays when it's not a free country. And the answer is it's not free politically, but it is actually very free economically, or rather it has been for the last few decades. So if you want to start a business in China, if you want to start a political party, forget it, that's not an option. But if you want to start a business or develop a new widget, there's very little to stop you. In fact, there are fewer bureaucratic regulatory hurdles than you would face in America to doing that. So actually, it has been quite a free place. That's the compromise Deng Xiaoping essentially gave China. But Xi Jinping is different. And he is very much taking the view that he wants to have state capitalism that tells people what industries they're going to work in, what areas they're going to innovate in. And I think he will therefore kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And China will lose its innovative mojo. So that's one aspect of freedom. But the other aspect of freedom is just the freedom of the individual to decide what he's doing. Now, how does that operate in a corporate context? Well, I think it's very important to understand that you can't have chaos. You can't just set up a company and say anyone can do anything they like all day. Here's a desk, get on with it. It's not going to work that way. Companies do have to have a focus and a structure. But if you free your employees to use part of their time, like Google does, or some of the employees to go off into a skunk works and think big thoughts, like Bell Labs did for AT&T and so on, if you set up ways in which employees in an organization can be free to develop new ideas, then I think you will benefit from it. And I once asked Jeff Bezos how he prevents Amazon becoming a large, sclerotic, anti-innovative big company like most big companies become. And one of the answers he gave me was that he operates a sort of system where if there's a maverick, weird idea that occurs to an employee somewhere in the organization, and he takes it to his boss, and his boss says, well, I think it's a pretty bad idea, but I'll have a conversation with my colleagues. And the colleagues all say it's a bad idea, except one. Then that idea must feed up through the organization to senior management. One person can champion an idea. In other words, you cannot have majority rule crushing the life out of innovative ideas. You have to allow for some weird stuff to percolate upwards. That's another example of freedom, I think.
Okay, excellent. So essentially, the more freedom there is to innovate, the better. It's true of countries. It's true also of companies based on the way you're sharing that. What else have you found enables some of these very large companies that you would expect to be hyper bureaucratic, but somehow they've maintained their edge at innovation? What other key ingredients do you think we could emulate based on their success?
Well, I think it's worth thinking about the skunk works concept. This was the phrase used for Lockheed's. Lockheed had this idea of putting a bunch of bright people off to one side and telling them to think blue sky thoughts about aeroplanes. And that came up with some really amazing designs for aeroplanes, that, particularly for the military, that was significant. Google has done something similar with Google X. Google X is the sort of department of Google that is supposed to think really wacky ideas and see if any of them come true. Now, it's come up with some really bad ideas. It had an idea for making fuel out of water, which essentially involved repealing the second law of thermodynamics, and they had to give up on it. It wasn't a good idea. Fine, great, no problem. Failing is good in this in innovation. They had another idea which seemed to be very good. It came up with a really smart technology. It got rolled out. It got turned into a product. It was called Google Glass. You may remember it. You could have a display on your spectacles, so that you could actually use a computer built inside your glasses. And it was launched, and nobody wanted to buy it. I mean, it was a flop. Hard to spot that was going to be the case. It felt at that time like anything Google did was going to be touched with gold. That wasn't the case. But if you read what the Google X guys say, they aren't frightened by failing in this way. Several failures is good. It shows that you're swinging and missing, and you might then hit the next ball for a home run. So I think that's a really interesting thought, that there's no point in going for the small stuff. Go for the big stuff. Go for something that might be a home run in terms of changing the world. I mean, look at the way Steve Jobs did it. Steve Jobs is an exception to my rule that individuals don't matter as much as we think in the stories of innovations, that it's not about heroes. Steve Jobs clearly imprinted his personality on the computer industry. For example, he just had this weird idea that computers should look beautiful. I mean, nobody thought of that before. I mean, I remember being very shocked when I first saw a colorful Apple desktop computer, and I thought, how weird. I thought computers were always black or gray, that sort of attitude is great. But don't get away from the fact, it isn't all fun. It isn't all wacky ideas. It isn't all creativity. The other lesson, the key lesson, is just to trial and error the heck out of it. Try. Keep doing experiments like Edison did till you've cracked the problem. And there's a wonderful remark made about Orville and Wilbur Wright by the guy who took the photograph of them on the beach at Kitty Hawk that day in December. He said they were the workingest boys I ever knew. So it's hard work. Don't neglect that point when you're talking to your staff and your colleagues.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you. So I came up with 2 suggested action items for our audience, which I myself am going to follow based on what you just shared. The first one is, for everybody listening, what is one very specific thing you can do to give your team more room to innovate on a potential home run idea without fear? So I will paste that in, and that's just one idea. The other prompt is, or call to action is, what is one experiment that you're not running in your organization right now that you absolutely should be, because it could make a big difference? So just 2 suggestions from me, Matt, based on what you shared. If you have a prompt of your own to add to this, feel free. Otherwise, I'll jump to the next one.
I think that's a lovely pair of challenges, and I'll be thinking about them even for my own home, which is after all a business.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to be pasting those. And Matt, you started going from like the organizational environment to some of those individual things, right? So whether it's hard work or other things. So let's focus a little bit of this. Like, since the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned several times that it's not just about that mad genius. It's not just about that innovator. At the same time, it takes an entrepreneur. It takes, either the CEO entrepreneur or an entrepreneur internally who just like, risks that failure. And you actually open your whole book with the Schumpeter quote that I'm going to quickly read because I found it so powerful. Innovation offers the carrot of spectacular reward or the stick of destitution. So for those of us in the business of innovation, or whose fortunes mentally, physically, spiritually, materially are going to be based on the outcome of those innovations, what have you found to be the most powerful lessons for the individuals engaged? How they conduct themselves? What are the kind of things to do more or less of when you're in the business of innovation to maximize your chances at an individual level?
I think probably the most important thing is persistence. That is to say, the guys who just didn't give up, they were obsessive, they kept at it, they kept trying things until they made it work. this was characteristic of the Wright brothers, but it's also characteristic of the guy I write about in the introduction of the book, who invented sliced bread. Best thing since sliced bread, we sometimes say. I looked up who was it, and he's a guy called Rohlweder in the American Midwest in the 1920s, who just said, I'm going to invent a bread slicer. And everyone said, well, why? You're an optician. And he said, well, I just think it's the best idea. And he went around, and at one point his workshop burnt down, but he just kept going. And eventually he found a baker who would go into partnership with him. And he realized that actually sliced bread's only good as part of a system. In other words, there's no point in making sliced bread if it isn't properly packaged, because then it's just going to dry out. So actually you've got to invent bread packaging at the same time. And the thing took off. Now that might seem like a trivial example, but it's a nice little story. So persistence is very important, but the importance of changing your mind too. I mean, I think, to spot that the opportunity isn't where you thought it was. The Google guys didn't realize they were inventing a search engine at first. They thought they were cataloging the internet. They didn't realize that what they were inventing was going to be profitable or lucrative at all, until someone explained it to them. But they pivoted very efficiently to make their business into an extremely successful business. So persistence, but nimble agility in being prepared to change your mind. Being open-minded is incredibly important. I mean, the people who are so persistent that they refuse to listen to others or take on account new lessons, I don't think they do achieve much in the way of innovation. But the trouble is, this isn't an exact science. I can't write a formula for the perfect entrepreneurial innovator. There are different lessons from different people and different stories. And let me say it again, it isn't all about one individual. You've got to be prepared to share and collaborate with other people.
All right, excellent. So the prompt that came to mind for me, based on like a call to action, based on what you just shared, is maybe we can all think about like, what's that key thing that we need to continue being relentlessly persistent about, no matter how painful it is, and no matter how much we might contemplate, like maybe is it even worth it, that thing? What's the one thing to be more persistent about? But also, what's the one thing maybe we need to change our mind on, right? So let's, that could be a good way to balance both forces. You have several chapters, or at least like a couple of chapters that are actually based on the resistance to innovation, Matt. So, and this is at all levels, right? Like governmental, but also at like organizational people. So as a human race, we're obviously pretty great at like figuring out solutions, right? But we're also incredibly good at like infighting and things like that. So share with us what you found to be the biggest obstacles to innovation, as well as these like the fakes and the fads and like what looks like not all that shines as gold. Like share with us the biggest obstacles and then the biggest kind of missteps that you're seeing.
Yeah. Well, in theory, we all love innovation. In practice, we're very easy to persuade into resisting innovation. There are going to be vested interests out there saying, "Oh, you don't want that; it's dangerous." Or you don't want that; it's you preferred the old way of doing something. So one of the lovely stories that I tell in the book is the resistance to coffee. I mean, coffee was an innovation in the 1500s in Europe, and wherever it went, there were attempts to ban it. Why? Because it was new. And people always try and ban new things. And they said it might be dangerous, it might be bad for you. And the wine and beer industry actually paid for doctors to write pamphlets saying this coffee thing is going to mess up your kidneys or something. I mean, it was pseudoscience, but it was there. But more important, kings didn't like coffee. And the reason they didn't like coffee was because people drank it in coffee houses, and they sat together in coffee houses talking about whether the king was doing a good job or not. And kings don't like that. And so again and again, you find rulers banning coffee for no better reason than that it leads people to talk about whether or not kings are doing a good job. So fake news is something that kings don't like, to bring it right up to today's example. So that's a slightly jokey and trivial example, but it reminds us that when we're told, "Ooh, you mustn't accept genetically modified crops," or "Ooh, I don't know whether this vaccine is going to be good for you," that quite a lot of what we're being told might be pseudoscience, and we need to be open-minded to the fact that there are people out there with vested interests trying to stop technologies. One that I'm very interested in, it's a relatively small example, is vaping. That is to say, electronic cigarettes. The UK has actually taken a very different attitude to the US on this, has on the whole encouraged vaping as long as the product is, as long as there's product safety, product standards are obeyed, that it's, that the ingredients are approved and so on. And the idea is that it's going to replace smoking, and that's a good thing because smoking is much more dangerous than vaping. And so in the UK, we've had enormous take up, and as far as we can make out, very few or no deaths as a result of vaping, and huge number of lives saved. The US took the sort of prohibition approach, like it did with alcohol in 1920, and said, look, we want to ban this because it might encourage people into smoking and so on. And as a result, it's created a black market, which has led to dangerous products being vaped and people actually dying from it. As we know, there was a famous few cases of that. Maybe 150 people have died as a result of vaping with these strange ingredients that are used with the drug trade rather than with nicotine. So that's a very nice example of a technology being managed in a different way, in a positive or negative way. But there are big corporate interests ranged against innovation. Just to give you another example, 1948, the head of the Federal Communications Commission said, you know what, we could use radios as telephones and everybody could have one, because what you could do is have cells where basically the phone doesn't have to talk to the other person's phone. It just has to talk to the nearest base station, which then has a land link to the other person's phone. That's the cellular phone idea. And he said, why don't we do this? And then for the next 40 years, the government wouldn't allocate spectrum, electromagnetic spectrum, to cellular services. Why? Because on the one hand, the television companies wanted to monopolize the spectrum for themselves. And on the other hand, the radio communication companies, the companies that basically did walkie-talkies for offshore oil rigs and things like that, they wanted to argue against cellular phones because they were a threat to their business. So, we could have had cell phones quite a lot earlier. Now, I'm not saying they'd have been great. In the 1960s, they'd have been the size of bricks and the battery wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes and all that. But nonetheless, they could have developed sooner than they did. It needed a liberalization, government to step in to do that. And then think about things like, I've already mentioned vaccines, but medical devices. Why don't we have point-of-care DNA diagnostic devices for telling you whether you've got a virus? Technology could have been developed in any time in the last 5, maybe even 10 years. And the reason we don't have it is because, on the whole, it's very difficult to get a new medical device licensed by the government. It takes many years and it costs a lot of money. So if you're thinking of doing that, you've probably said to yourself, no, I think I'll go and start a video game company instead, because nobody needs to give me permission to do that. So the delay in government approval for medical devices is something that we need to tackle, and we are tackling it during this pandemic. Suddenly we're finding that you can get approval in a matter of weeks for a new medical device. Well, if we can do that now, why couldn't we do it last year?
Excellent, Matt. That was awesome. Before I ask you my final question, I want to encourage everybody in the audience, if you have any thoughts or questions, this is your opportunity. Please type it into the Q&A box on the Zoom screen, and we will do our very best with Matt to get through all of them before our hour's up. Matt, final question to you is, you talk about this thing called an innovation famine. You also mentioned earlier in our conversation that there's lots of opportunities out there. So what would you say, like, just share with us, like, what's your kind of call to action to us as far as like how you see the state of innovation right now, and what are the key opportunities we should all be keeping in mind as organizational leaders that are really dedicated to making the biggest impact that we can?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I say, I think we are living through a period when we could be having more innovation than we do. We're not having the turnover of companies that we used to have. We're not having, the age of entrepreneurs is going up, not down. There's lots of areas, leaving aside digital innovation, where it's not happening very fast at all. And I'd like to see us change that. I mean, I think we need to learn to get back to the sort of freebooting, wildcatting view of innovation that America had in the 1960s in particular. Britain had maybe 100 years ago, and that China has had until very recently, but I think maybe losing. I just think that if we did that, we would find that the benefits could be enormous. I mean, think of the things that we would like to be able to solve. What about aging? You know, the fact that our bodies get creaky with age isn't inevitable. There are mechanisms. Let's invent ways to slow that down. I think if you ask me to bet where the most exciting innovations are going to come from in the next 20 years, I would probably say biotechnology. I think the age of the computer may be coming to an end compared with the age of biotechnology just starting, and the age of transport having happened, as it were, 50 years ago. So that's my guess, is what we need to be doing. We need to be taking genomics seriously, biotechnology seriously. I love a phrase that comes from a guy called Roy Amara, who was a futurologist and computer scientist in Silicon Valley in the 1960s. And he said that we underestimate the impact of new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. So in other words, we expect too much of a technology in the first 10 to 15 years, but we don't expect enough of it in the next 15 years. And you can see that very clearly with, say, genomics. You know, the sequencing of the human genome in 2000 led to Bill Clinton saying we're going to cure cancer and da-da-da. And that looks like it's overblown. We haven't cured cancer, right? And it's 20 years on. But watch this space. I think it's about to accelerate what's coming out of biotechnology, and we're about to see some exciting stuff coming from that area.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's an excellent positive note for us all to all keep in mind. Gonna dive into these questions. Let's do, like, as best we can, 1 minute or so answers to get through all of them. The first one is from Diego Cordoba. He says, we have a big challenge with climate change and not sufficient innovations fast enough. What do you think we need to do to go faster?
Well, I would quite agree with Diego, because we've discovered over the past 25 years that we can't live without carbon-based fuels. It's not possible to replace them easily. You know, when we replaced chlorofluorocarbons to protect the ozone layer, it turned out to be easy. There were substitutes that were just as cheap, could be discovered very quickly. That's not proving the case. Renewable energy is not able to fill the gap. It's far too expensive, it takes up far too much room, far too much materials, has far too low energy return on energy invested. Nuclear could do it, but we've cut nuclear off from innovation. We've made it very hard to innovate in nuclear. We've built up such an enormously expensive regulatory approval system that it's basically impossible to get a new design approved. We have to stick with old-fashioned designs that were developed basically in the 1960s. So that's the first thing I'd do, is reform nuclear regulation so that we could get molten salt reactors, thorium reactors, inherently safe reactors, and perhaps fusion reactors going. That's the technology that will give us zero carbon energy. And the other technology that could do it would be carbon capture and storage. If we can work out cheap ways of trapping carbon and putting it under the seabed. How are we going to do that? Well, I don't think we're going to do that by throwing money at scientists saying, here's a, try a pilot project in this. I think we're going to do it by creating a market in it, creating telling companies that they have to bury a percentage of their CO2 emissions. And it doesn't matter how, it doesn't matter where, you've got to find a way to do it. You've got to prove you've done it. And that way they will go out there and discover entrepreneurs who've got ideas for how to do it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. Here are two questions that are related. So Pavel Ferrari asks, any thoughts around the role and how to infuse ethics in the process of innovation? Would be very interesting to hear, as well as the inherent challenges that come with it. So Pavel asked that question, and then on somewhat of a related note, Hugo Naley asks, could you please share your thoughts about gene editing technologies such as CRISPR? So ethics, the infusion of ethics into innovation, and then what do you think about gene editing?
Mm-hmm. Well, ethics is very important in innovation, but we mustn't cut ourselves off from the point that innovation itself can be ethical. I've already given the example of the mosquito net and how that has drastically reduced malaria mortality in Africa. Another example, a similar example, also championed by the Gates Foundation, is the development of a pneumococcus vaccine. Poor kids dying in Africa because of pneumococcus. No lucrative market for the pharmaceutical industry to go off and invent a vaccine. So what does Gates do? They go and say, here's a prize. Here's a lot of money that we're putting aside that we will use to top up the price you get for selling a pneumococcus vaccine to a kid in Africa. And that proves enough to get 3 companies interested. They go off, they develop pneumococcus vaccine, and 750,000 lives have been saved by that project by the Gates Foundation. A really nice example of innovation itself as an important ethical opportunity. But I don't think that's what was meant by the question. How do you encourage innovators to be ethical in the way they do it, and to do ethical things and not do evil things with innovation? And the main answer I have is to do it in the open. If you're going to try and invent something evil in full view of other people, then the chances are we in society are going to find a way to stop you. So you have to go and do it in secret. And that's essentially what the computer virus industry does, if you like. It doesn't work in the open. And as a result, it isn't gaining ground. I remember 20 years ago, the predictions that we would all be overwhelmed with computer viruses. Actually, we aren't. We're able to keep one step ahead. Why? Because the solutions to computer viruses can be shared and can draw upon the experiences of millions of people around the world, whereas the designing of the virus itself has to be a secret, has to be kept by some evil bloke in, I don't know, wherever he is, hidden away in a basement somewhere. So the sunshine is the best disinfectant, as someone once said. And I think that's true in terms of ethics. Just on CRISPR, really interesting story, CRISPR, one of the great innovations of the last decade, probably the most important one, precise gene editing. Very interesting to understand how it came about, because it looks like a pure university innovation. Berkeley and MIT are having a row about who deserves the patent and the Nobel Prize and everything else that goes with that. But actually, when you look, they picked up the idea from the yogurt industry, which was trying to understand how bacteria get sick and how they defend against viruses and how they keep libraries of virus sequences so they can recognize them. That's the technology we've essentially adapted for gene editing. And then if you look, where did the yogurt industry get it from? They got it from a university researcher working on salt-loving microbes in Spain, which was supported by the salt industry in that area. It's a really nice example of how ideas go from academia to industry and back again. It's a two-way relationship, and I think that's a terribly important lesson that needs to be learned. We tend to think in terms of spinning ideas out of universities into the real world. Actually, quite often it's going the other way.
Excellent. Thank you. I did not know that the origins of CRISPR was from the yogurt industry. Just makes you think that innovation truly can come from anywhere. Matt, the next question is from John Robinson. And just in a nutshell here, what do you make of current CEOs such as Elon Musk, right? You've studied all these great individuals in your book. Just if you had a couple of thoughts to share, we'd love to hear that from you.
Right. Well, some current CEOs are incredibly admirable people. I've already mentioned Bezos. you know, he's a friend, so that's part of it. But I think he genuinely is the Edison of our day, the man who knows how to press the right buttons to get innovation to happen, who's relentless, who's persistent, who's careful about it, and who's changed the world. I don't have quite the same admiration for Elon Musk. I think he's too much of a showman, and I think he's too addicted to a habit which I suspect he picked up from Steve Jobs, which goes under the slightly unattractive term, fake it till you make it. In other words, announce something before you even know how to deliver on the promise. I mean, arguably he did that just this week when he said that he was going to make a big announcement about batteries and it was going to change the world. And then he had to row back because the announcement wasn't as exciting as expected, and $50 billion was wiped off his company's share price. So, you know, Musk is certainly an interesting guy, and he's achieved a great deal. I'm critical in the book of one of his ideas, which is the Hyperloop, the idea that putting buses in tubes, in vacuum tubes underground, and that'll be cheaper than either airplanes or trains, I don't find convincing, and I give lots of reasons why. This isn't just me going off the top of my head. So I think Elon Musk can achieve a lot, but he does represent some of the less attractive side of innovators. What used to be called in the 17th century projectors, people who have projects that they are desperate to interest you in. There's a little too much of the showman about Musk for me. I hope I haven't said anything libelous there, and maybe he's listening in and can come back with a comment.
Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate the answer. Certainly inspiring to see the rockets landing, you know, like those visuals.
That's true.
The car flying past the earth, things like that sometimes really makes a difference.
Yeah, and Bezos and Musk are the two people who are going to transform space. I would agree with that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next one is Mike Flannery, real quick. How does the blockchain rate as an innovation in your view?
It's too early to tell. I mean, Zhou Enlai said that about the French Revolution, but it really is too early to tell whether blockchain is going to transform the world or not, in my view. I think it's a very exciting concept. I think it might be very important, but we're in that disappointing phase, that first 15 years that Roy Amara talked about of blockchain, when the hype that it's going to replace currencies, that it's going to do away with the need for lawyers and accountants, we're going to have smart contracts, etc., is all great, and it might turn out to be true. But I think we'll look back about 10 years from now and say, what was that all about? You know, come on, where are these blockchain applications that were going to change the world? 10 years after that, the smile might be on the other side of your face, saying, actually, you shouldn't have sold your blockchain shares. They've done really well, or something like that. So that's my guess, is that blockchain is going to be disappointing for a while, but it might be very exciting in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Here's one from Giancarlo Di Mella, who asks, how do you create spaces for innovation in an organization that is moving towards standardization, in this case, the manufacturing industry?
Actually, that's a really good question, because standardization is a really important part of the world, and is actually a great help to innovation in some senses. You know, I mentioned the shipping container as an example of a sort of standardization innovation that helped create world trade. And how do you continue to be innovative in an industry that is shifting towards a particular standard on something? Well, I think the standard gives you an opportunity, because if the world is going to agree to a standard, you know, design of, let's say, we're going to suddenly abolish the fact that in the UK we have different electric plugs than they do in Europe, and then you do in America, and they do in Australia. We're suddenly going to standardize the world plug. Then the first person to make the world plug is going to clean up, because he knows where his market is going to be. So the standard surely creates an opportunity for an innovator. And let me just riff on that a bit longer. Do you remember how clunky plugs used to be until Apple came along and made these really neat little plugs that go on the end of your phone charger? You know, that plugs are standard within America. We can all agree on that. You don't have different types of plugs in America. Is plug the right word, or do you use the word jack? I can't remember. Anyway, whatever. But within that standard, it has been possible to be innovative, as Apple has shown.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you so much. So in the last couple minutes we have remaining, I want to first of all thank you everybody for joining live. I want to thank you, Matt, for the extraordinary job you did on summarizing the key points from all the research and observations you've had. I want everybody, before I ask Matt the very final question of the day, really want everyone at the last minute of this, so when the conversation is over, before you rush off to your emails or the next meeting and so on, take a minute. I'm going to try to end a few seconds early to just write what was the one key thing you learned and what's the one key action you want to take. And then if you feel so inclined, join the WhatsApp integration group and let's keep each other accountable for that. I'll be doing the same myself. So Matt, last question for you. Having shared everything that you shared, seeing what our audience also had as far as questions, what is your one key final call to action for all of us here? When you look at the world today, the state of innovation, when you look at supply and demand, what do you think is most needed? And what would you say to us as business leaders as a call to action? Maybe before you share that, if you can share with us how we can best support you as a community in your work and in your endeavors, we'd love that as well. So over to you to wrap it up.
Well, I think we just need to get out there and evangelize on behalf of innovation. It can solve many of the problems we have in the world. We mustn't get too pessimistic about the state of the world. There are wonderful opportunities, but innovation will give us even more opportunities. And to the extent that we can, say to politicians standing for election, what is your position on innovation? We can say to regulators, have you thought about whether your regulation is helpful or unhelpful to innovation? We can say to businesses, are you allowing innovation within your company? Are you allowing innovative rivals to have a go at your market? Or are you being a stick in the mud company that's trying to stop innovation happening? So I think trying to hold people to account, businessmen, politicians, people in everyday life, just talk about innovation more. I think that's what I want people to do.
Excellent, Matt. Well, you gave us great ingredients for a recipe for better innovation, how to think about it, how to implement it, how to create environments for it, and how to have a bigger perspective about it than just the things that are right in front of us today, but in a historical sense. So I really appreciate you being here. I highly recommend everybody Matt's book. It's got, kind of like the history of innovation of the most critical industries that have shaped our world and are going to continue to. So thank you, Matt, for putting that together. And thank you again for being here today.
Thank you, Barry, very much indeed. I've enjoyed the conversation very much.
Same here. Look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope to see you in our integration group. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.